I'm Marcus Thompson. I'm 28 years old. And the day my father laughed in my face when I told him I was going to buy my own house turned out to be the same day I unknowingly set in motion the events that would lead to me purchasing his foreclosed McMansion for pennies on the dollar. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sound of my father's laughter still echoes in my mind sometimes. It wasn't the warm, genuine laughter I remembered from my childhood when my mother Helen was still alive. This was different. It was sharp, mocking, and filled with a cruelty. That seemed to have taken root in our family home on Hillcrest Drive the day Rebecca moved in. Bill Thompson sat in his oversized leather recliner. It's the one that dominated the living room of the house he'd bought 3 years earlier. A sprawling McMansion that screamed new money and stretched budgets. His beer sat sweating on the glass coffee table, leaving rings that Rebecca would passive-aggressively clean later while making pointed comments about respect for nice things. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors that Rebecca had insisted on installing. Everything in this house was expensive, impressive, and cold. It was nothing like the cozy 3-bedroom ranch on Maple Street where I'd grown up, where my mother's vegetable garden had flourished in the backyard and family photos covered every surface. That house had been sold within 6 months of Helen's funeral, with Rebecca declaring it too small and outdated for their new life together. I had come over for what was supposed to be a casual family barbecue, one of Rebecca's attempts at creating the picture-perfect blended family she could post about on social media. Jordan, my 19-year-old half-brother, was home from UC San Diego for the weekend, fresh from his sophomore year that my father was proudly funding without a single student loan in sight. He lounged on the matching leather sofa, scrolling through his phone with the casual indifference of someone who had never worried about money, never stayed awake at night calculating whether he could afford both groceries and gas for the week. The conversation had started innocently enough. Rebecca was showing off the new granite countertops in the kitchen, mentioning how the house was now worth nearly $800,000, double what they'd paid for it. She spoke about real estate values with the authority of someone who watched HGTV religiously, but had never actually bought or sold property herself. That's when I made the mistake of sharing my news, my small victory that I'd been genuinely excited about. I had just put an offer on a duplex on Pine Avenue. It wasn't much to look at, built in the 1960s with brown shag carpet and outdated fixtures, but it was mine. The numbers worked. I could live in one unit and rent out the other, building equity while having tenants help pay the mortgage. At 28, I would finally have something that belonged to me, something no one could take away. I had saved every penny for the down payment, working double shifts at the gym, spending weekends doing landscaping work and picking up odd construction jobs whenever I could find them. When I told them about the duplex, the room fell silent. Jordan looked up from his phone for the first time all afternoon, his eyebrows raised in surprise. Rebecca's perfectly glossed lips curved into what she probably thought was an encouraging smile, but her eyes held that familiar look of condescending pity. And then my father started laughing. Began as a chuckle, then grew into full-bodied laughter that made his face red and his eyes water. He slapped his knee like I'd just told the funniest joke he'd ever heard. When he finally caught his breath, he wiped his eyes and shook his head with the kind of paternal disappointment usually reserved for children who insisted they could fly. A duplex on Pine Avenue, Marcus? Really? That neighborhood is barely a step up from the projects. You're going to mortgage yourself into poverty for some rundown rental property in the worst part of Riverside. His voice carried the tone of someone explaining basic math to a particularly slow student. You don't understand real estate, son? You don't understand how money works. This house, he gestured around the opulent living room, this is an investment. This is how you build wealth, not by throwing good money after bad on some slum property. Rebecca nodded along, her expression a mixture of sympathy and superiority. Marcus, honey, she said in that saccharine voice she used when she wanted to sound motherly, maybe you should wait a few more years. Save up for something nicer. You don't want to get trapped in a bad investment. She glanced at Bill with a look that said she was being generous by even entertaining my foolish dreams. The heat of embarrassment crawled up my neck, but it was quickly replaced by something colder and more familiar. This was the same dismissal I'd faced when I'd told them I was going to community college instead of following Jordan to a 4-year university. The same tone they'd used when I'd chosen to work in construction instead of joining my father's company, where I would have been expected to smile and say thank you while being treated like an incompetent charity case. But what stung the most wasn't the laughter or the condescension. It was the look in Jordan's eyes, my half-brother who had never worked a day in his life, who drove a car our father had bought him and attended college on our father's dime, was looking at me with pity, as if my dreams were so small and pathetic that even he, barely out of his teens, could see how foolish they were. I sat there in that cold, expensive living room, surrounded by people who shared my last name but felt like strangers, made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to argue with them. I wasn't going to defend my choice or try to explain my vision. I was going to let my actions speak for themselves. Someday I promised myself they would understand exactly what I was capable of building. The duplex closing happened on a Thursday morning in March. I remember the date exactly because it was the same day Rebecca posted photos of their spring break vacation to Maui on Instagram, captioning them with grateful heart emojis and hashtags about blessed family time. I was sitting in the sterile conference room at First National Bank of Riverside, signing what felt like hundreds of documents while they were sipping Mai Tais on a beach that cost more than my entire down payment. The real estate agent, a tired-looking woman named Carol who had been selling houses in Riverside for 30 years, spread the paperwork across the scratched wooden table. She had that weary professionalism of someone who had seen every kind of buyer come through her office, from nervous first-timers to cocky investors who thought they knew everything about real estate. I fell somewhere in between, armed with months of research and a determination that probably bordered on obsession. The duplex at 2847 Pine Avenue wasn't anyone's dream property. Built in 1967, it squatted on a corner lot like a brown brick toad, surrounded by chain-link fencing and dying palm trees. The neighborhood had seen better days. Back when the aerospace industry was booming in Riverside, was full of optimistic young families building their version of the American dream, now it was caught in that uncomfortable space between decline and gentrification, where half the houses had security bars on the windows and the other half were being bought up by investors who saw potential in the proximity to downtown. Carol handed me the keys with a smile that managed to be both congratulatory and sympathetic. Congratulations, Marcus. You're officially a homeowner and a landlord. The previous owner left some furniture in the back unit, so you might want to take a look at what's salvageable before you decide on renovations. She gathered her papers with the efficiency of someone who had 3 more closings that afternoon. Remember, being a landlord is a business. Don't let tenants take advantage of your good nature. I drove to the property with a mixture of excitement and terror churning in my stomach. The west unit, which would be my home, was empty, except for ancient carpet that had probably been brown originally, but had faded to an indeterminate color somewhere between beige and despair. The kitchen cabinets were painted a shade of yellow that reminded me of old mustard, and the bathroom featured pink tile that hadn't been fashionable since the Carter administration. But it was mine. The east unit still had a tenant, Maria Santos, a single mother with 2 kids who worked double shifts at the regional medical center. She had been living there for 3 years under the previous owner, paying $800 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment that she kept immaculate despite its obvious flaws. When I knocked on her door to introduce myself as the new owner, she answered, with the wariness of someone who had learned that change usually meant bad news. I'm not raising the rent, I told her before she could ask. At least not this year. I just want to be a good landlord and make sure everything is working properly. Do you have any maintenance issues I should know about? The relief on her face was immediate and genuine. The previous owner had been responsive to major problems but ignored smaller issues until they became major problems. The kitchen faucet dripped constantly and the bedroom window wouldn't open properly, making the summer months unbearable without air conditioning they couldn't afford to run. That first month was a crash course in property management. Plumbing, electrical work, and the 100 small disasters that define rental property ownership. I spent every weekend at Home Depot, loading my truck with supplies and watching YouTube videos to learn skills my father had never bothered to teach me. The irony wasn't lost on me that Bill Thompson owned a construction company but had raised a son who had to learn basic home repair from internet tutorials. Danny Chen became my unofficial construction mentor during this period. We had met at the 24/7 fitness gym where I worked the overnight shift. Discovered we both harbored dreams bigger than our current circumstances. Danny was working toward his contractor's license while supporting his aging parents and paying off student loans from a computer science degree that hadn't opened as many doors as promised. He had grown up in a family where manual labor was respected and practical skills were passed down from father to son. Unlike the Thompson household where my father's success had somehow translated into protecting his children from ever having to get their hands dirty, Danny would come over after his day job, bringing tools and expertise in exchange for pizza and the promise that I would help him with his first investment property when the time came. Together, we stripped wallpaper, installed new fixtures, and learned that renovation shows made everything look deceptively simple. The yellow kitchen cabinets got a fresh coat of white paint. The pink bathroom tile was covered with neutral beige that wouldn't offend future tenants. The hardwood floors, hidden under decades of carpet, were sanded and refinished to reveal beautiful oak that made both units feel twice as expensive. The work was exhausting and sometimes frustrating, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way my previous jobs had never been. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Every improvement increased the value of my investment. Every skill I learned made me more capable and independent. I was building something that belonged to me, creating equity and cash flow that would provide security my father had never offered and couldn't take away. 3 months after closing, I had my first real test as a landlord when Maria's refrigerator died on a Saturday morning. She called apologetically, knowing that appliance replacement wasn't technically her responsibility, but hoping I might be willing to help since she couldn't afford to replace it herself and had 2 kids who needed to eat. My father would have told her that appliances were the tenant's responsibility and suggested she check the classified ads for used options. Instead, I drove to Sears and bought a new refrigerator, arranging for same-day delivery. The cost ate into my first month's profit. But Maria's gratitude and the knowledge that I was providing safe, decent housing for a hardworking family made it worthwhile. This was the kind of landlord I wanted to be, someone who understood that rental properties weren't just investments, but homes where people built their lives. By the end of the first year, the duplex was generating positive cash flow of $400 monthly after expenses. Maria had renewed her lease and referred a friend who was looking for affordable housing. The property value had increased. As the neighborhood continued its slow gentrification, with young professionals and small families discovering that Pine Avenue offered more space for less money than the trendy downtown lofts, I had also started attending real estate investment meetings at the Riverside Country Club, the same club where my father played golf and complained about his ungrateful son to his buddies. The irony of learning advanced investment strategies in the building where Bill Thompson held court was not lost on me, but the education was invaluable. I met successful investors who had started with single properties and built portfolios worth millions. People who understood that real estate was a long-term wealth-building strategy rather than a get-rich-quick scheme. The real estate investment group met every second Tuesday at the Riverside Country Club, at a conference room that overlooked the 18th hole, where my father spent most Saturday mornings perfecting his mediocre golf game. The meetings were led by Frank Rodriguez, 60-year-old former aerospace engineer, who had transitioned into real estate after the industry downsizing in the early 2000s. Frank had the kind of quiet confidence that came from surviving multiple market cycles and building a portfolio of over 200 rental units across Southern California. I had found the group through a flyer at the local real estate office, and my first meeting had been an exercise in imposter syndrome. The room was filled with successful professionals, retirees with substantial savings to invest, and established landlords who casually discussed million-dollar acquisitions over coffee and pastries. I was the youngest person there by at least 15 years, wearing my best button-down shirt and hoping nobody would ask too many questions about my single duplex investment. Frank had a teaching style that combined practical experience with brutal honesty about the realities of real estate investing. He didn't promise easy money or quick riches. Instead, he talked about cash flow analysis, market trends, property management challenges, and the importance of building relationships with reliable contractors, property managers, and lending institutions. We're filled with actual numbers from real deals, both successful investments and expensive mistakes that had taught him valuable lessons. The group attracted a diverse mix of investors at different stages of their journeys. There was Margaret Kim, a retired teacher who had started with a single rental property and now owned 12 units that provided her entire retirement income. David Walsh was a police officer who flipped houses on weekends, using his knowledge of different neighborhoods to identify undervalued properties before they hit the mainstream market. Sarah Johnson ran a property management company that handled over 300 units for our 200 units who wanted passive income without headaches of tenant management. What struck me most about these meetings was how different the conversations were from anything I had ever heard at family gatherings. These people talked about money in practical, strategic terms. They discussed leveraging equity to acquire additional properties, the tax advantages of depreciation and cost segregation studies, and the long-term wealth-building potential of real estate appreciation combined with mortgage paydown. It was a completely different language from my father's boastful stories about his latest expensive purchase or Rebecca's obsession with keeping up appearances. Frank took a particular interest in my situation after I mentioned during one meeting that I was doing most of the renovation work myself to keep costs down. He approached me after the session with an offer that would change the trajectory of my real estate education. His property management company needed reliable contractors for smaller renovation projects, and he was willing to train someone who showed genuine interest in learning the business properly. The arrangement was simple. I would work weekends on Frank's renovation projects, learning advanced techniques and earning money that could be reinvested into additional properties. In exchange, Frank would mentor me on real estate analysis, financing strategies, and the systems needed to scale beyond single property ownership. It was an apprenticeship that combined hands-on construction skills with sophisticated investment knowledge. My first project with Frank was a 3-bedroom ranch house in the Magnolia Center neighborhood, about 10 minutes from my duplex. The previous owner had been an elderly woman whose adult children lived out of state and wanted a quick sale rather than dealing with the extensive repairs needed to bring the property up to rental standards. Frank had purchased it below market value with the understanding that significant work would be required before it could be rented. The house needed new plumbing, electrical updates, fresh paint throughout, and kitchen and bathroom renovations. Working alongside Frank's regular crew, I learned advanced techniques that YouTube videos couldn't teach. How to properly install PEX plumbing to prevent future leaks, the correct way to run electrical circuits that would pass inspection and provide reliable service, tile installation methods that would withstand years of tenant use without cracking or coming loose. But the real education happened during our conversations while working. Frank had started investing in 1995 with a single rental property purchased, using savings from his engineering job. Over nearly 3 decades, he had weathered multiple market cycles, economic recessions, and personal financial challenges. He had made mistakes that cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars and learned lessons that had saved him millions. Real estate investing isn't about finding the perfect deal, Frank explained while we installed new kitchen cabinets. It's about finding good deals consistently and managing them properly over time. Most people fail because they're looking for home runs instead of building a system that generates steady singles and doubles. He talked about the importance of buying in areas with strong employment, diversity, population growth, and infrastructure development. Medical centers and major employers provided more stable rental demand than areas dependent on single industries. Frank also taught me about the psychological aspects of real estate investing that textbooks never covered. He has never covered how to evaluate sellers' motivations to structure win-win transactions, the importance of building relationships with real estate agents who understood investor needs rather than focusing solely on retail home buyers, how to analyze neighborhoods for early signs of gentrification or decline that would affect long-term property values. One of the most valuable lessons came during a conversation about tenant management. Frank's philosophy was that treating rental properties like a business meant screening tenants thoroughly. maintaining properties properly, and addressing issues promptly and professionally. He had developed systems for everything from lease applications to maintenance requests, ensuring consistent service that attracted quality tenants and minimized vacancy rates. Good tenants will stay for years if you're responsive to their needs and maintain the property properly, he explained. Bad tenants will destroy your profitability and steal years from your life dealing with problems. The key is having systems that help you identify good tenants before they move in and policies that protect your investment without being unreasonable. During my 6 months working with Frank, I completed renovations on 4 properties while continuing to manage my own duplex. The experience taught me that real estate investing was as much about understanding people and markets as it was about construction and finance. I learned to evaluate deals not just on current cash flow, but on long-term appreciation potential, neighborhood trends, and the quality of local schools and amenities that attracted stable tenants. The knowledge I gained during this period would prove invaluable when I started analyzing my next investment opportunity. Frank had taught me to think like a business owner rather than just a property owner, to understand that successful real estate investing required systems, relationships, and patience rather than luck or intuition. By the time I was ready to purchase my second property, I had developed a comprehensive analysis framework that considered cash flow, appreciation potential, renovation costs, and exit strategies. I understood how to structure financing that maximized leverage while maintaining adequate cash reserves for unexpected expenses. Most importantly, I had learned to think long-term about building wealth rather than seeking immediate gratification. The lessons from Frank's mentorship extended beyond real estate into every aspect of my financial life. I began tracking expenses more carefully, maximizing tax advantages, and building relationships with professionals who could help accelerate my investment activities. The contrast with my father's approach to money and business became increasingly apparent as I developed more sophisticated strategies for building sustainable wealth. The transformation of our family began long before my mother Helen's cancer diagnosis, though none of us recognized it at the time. Looking back, I can see the fault lines that were already forming in my father's character, the subtle shifts in priorities that would later explode into full-scale abandonment of everything. My mother had built in our home on Maple Street. Bill Thompson had always been ambitious, but his ambition in the early years was tempered by genuine love for his family and respect for the simple pleasures of middle-class life. He worked hard at his construction company, coming home with dirt under his fingernails and stories about the houses he was building for other families. Now, Saturday mornings were spent fixing things around our modest ranch house, teaching me and Jordan basic carpentry skills while my mother worked in her vegetable garden that produced more tomatoes and peppers than our family could possibly eat. Those were the days when my father measured success by the stability he could provide rather than the impression he could make. He drove a practical pickup truck because it served his business needs, not because it projected any particular image. He wore Levi's and work boots because they were functional, not because they were fashionable. The Bill Thompson of my childhood was a man who understood the value of hard work and the satisfaction that came from building something with your own hands. The change began gradually during my mother's illness. Helen's cancer treatment was aggressive and expensive, despite having what we thought was comprehensive health insurance. The co-pays, experimental treatments, not covered by insurance, and lost income from my mother's part-time bookkeeping business created financial pressures that my father had never experienced. For the first time in his adult life, Bill Thompson felt poor, and the feeling triggered something dark and desperate in his personality. Instead of drawing closer to his family during this crisis, my father began to distance himself emotionally while throwing himself into expanding his business with an intensity that bordered on manic. He started bidding on larger commercial projects, hiring additional crews, and taking on debt to purchase newer equipment. When friends and family expressed concern about his aggressive expansion during such a difficult personal time, he dismissed their worries with talk about providing better medical care for Helen and securing the family's future. But even as a 15-year-old, I could see that my father's motivations were more complicated than altruism. He had started spending time with a different crowd, Successful contractors and developers who measured their worth by the size of their houses and the exclusivity of their country club memberships. These men talked about their businesses as vehicles for lifestyle enhancement rather than meaningful work, and their influence on my father was immediate and corrosive. Len noticed the changes too, though she was too exhausted from chemotherapy to address them directly. I remember finding her crying quietly in the kitchen one evening after my father had canceled another family dinner to attend a networking event at the country club. She was supposed to be celebrating the end of her second round of treatment, but instead she was eating leftover casserole alone while her husband schmoozed with people who had never shown any interest in our family before his business started growing. The medical bills became my father's excuse for every decision that prioritized business over family. He missed my junior year football games because he was meeting with potential clients, skipped family vacations because he couldn't afford to lose the income from weekend projects. He stopped helping with household maintenance because he was too busy managing his expanding operations. Each absence was justified as a sacrifice he was making for our financial security. But the pattern revealed a man who was using crisis as an opportunity to escape from family responsibilities he was finding increasingly burdensome. My mother's death in the spring of my senior year should have been a moment for our family to come together and support each other through grief. Instead, it became the catalyst for my father to completely reinvent himself and abandon the life he had built with Helen. Within weeks of the funeral, he was talking about selling the house on Maple Street and making a fresh start somewhere that didn't carry so many memories. The speed with which Rebecca entered our lives still takes my breath away when I think about it. She appeared at a business networking event just 3 months after my mother's funeral. A divorced real estate agent with expensive tastes and an intuitive understanding of men who were vulnerable to flattery and attention. Rebecca was everything my mother wasn't. Polished instead of natural, ambitious instead of content, focused on status instead of substance. Where Helen had encouraged my father's better angels, Rebecca fed his worst impulses. She praised his business acumen, while subtly criticizing the modest lifestyle he had maintained with my mother. She talked about his potential for greater success, while implying that his previous choices had been limited by a lack of vision or ambition. Within 6 months, she had convinced him that the life he had built with Helen was holding him back from achieving his true potential. The house on Maple Street, which had been the foundation of our family's stability for 20 years, became a symbol of everything Rebecca believed was wrong with my father's previous life. It was too small. For a successful businessman, the neighborhood was too working class for someone with his income potential. The memories it contained were preventing him from moving forward into a more prosperous future. Rebecca had a talent for making her criticisms sound like support and her demands seem like suggestions. She never directly attacked my mother's memory, but she consistently framed their relationship as a tragic limitation that had prevented my father from reaching his full potential. According to Rebecca's version of events, Helen's illness and death were opportunities for Bill to finally pursue the success he deserved without the burden of a wife who was satisfied with mediocrity. The sale of our family home happened with devastating efficiency. Rebecca handled all the arrangements, using her real estate connections to expedite the process and maximize the profit. The 3-bedroom ranch that had housed 20 years of family memories was reduced to a financial transaction that would provide capital for their new life. Together in Riverside Hills, I watched helplessly as my childhood was packed into boxes and sold at garage sales. My mother's garden was bulldozed to make the property more appealing to buyers who wanted a blank slate for their own landscaping vision. The kitchen where Helen had taught me to cook was updated with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that erased every trace of the warm, lived-in feeling that had made it the heart of our home. The most painful part of this transformation was watching my father's enthusiastic participation in erasing his previous life. He didn't seem to grieve the loss of the house where he had raised his children or the memories that were being discarded, along with my mother's belongings. Instead, he talked excitedly about their plans for the McMansion in Riverside Hills, the entertaining space that would be perfect for business relationships and the image of success that would attract better clients, and more profitable projects. Jordan, who was only 16 at the time, seemed to accept these changes with an adaptability that both impressed and disturbed me. He was eager to embrace the upgrades that came with Rebecca's influence: the larger bedroom, the premium cable, package, the promise of a better car when he turned 18. For Jordan, Rebecca represented opportunity and advancement, rather than the destruction of our family's foundation. But I couldn't forget the man my father had been before ambition and insecurity transformed him into someone I barely recognized. I remembered the Saturday mornings spent learning to use tools, the pride in his voice when he talked about building quality homes for working families, and the gentle way he had cared for my mother during her illness despite the financial pressures they faced. The systematic erasure of my place in the Thompson family accelerated once Bill and Rebecca settled into their new life in Riverside Hills. What had begun as subtle favoritism toward Jordan evolved into an elaborate system designed to ensure I understood my diminished status in their reconstructed family hierarchy. Every family gathering, every holiday celebration, every milestone became an opportunity to reinforce the message that I was an unwelcome reminder of a past they preferred to forget. The first major betrayal came during my senior year when college applications were due. I had been working part-time at a local hardware store after school, saving money for application fees and planning to attend UC Riverside's business program. My grades were solid, not spectacular, but good enough for admission to a state university. That would allow me to stay local while building toward a practical career in real estate or construction management. I had assumed that my college fund, which my parents had been contributing to since I was born, would cover tuition and basic expenses for a 4-year degree. The conversation happened in Rebecca's pristine kitchen, surrounded by granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. That cost more than most families spent on cars. I had brought over my completed applications, excited to share my plans, and get help with the financial aid paperwork that seemed overwhelmingly complicated for someone whose parents had always handled family finances privately. Rebecca was arranging white roses in a crystal vase, the kind of expensive fresh flowers that appeared weekly throughout their house as part of her commitment to maintaining an impressive home environment. She barely looked up when I spread my application materials across her kitchen island, though I caught her slight frown of disapproval at the sight of paperwork disrupting her carefully curated space. My father emerged from his home office wearing golf attire, preparing for an afternoon round with potential clients at the country club. When I asked about accessing my college fund to pay for tuition, his response was delivered with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather forecast. The college fund had been reallocated to cover some unexpected business expenses and improvements to their new house. There wasn't enough left to meaningfully contribute to my education costs. The revelation hit me like cold water. 18 years of birthday money, Christmas gifts from grandparents, and parental contributions had simply vanished into their lifestyle upgrade. When I pressed for details about exactly how much remained, Rebecca finally spoke up with that syrupy tone she used when delivering particularly devastating news, while maintaining plausible deniability about her cruelty. "Marcus, honey," she said, while adjusting her flower arrangement, "maybe this is actually a blessing in disguise. You're young and strong, and there's nothing wrong with working your way through college like plenty of other kids do. It builds character and teaches valuable lessons about the real world that privileged students never learn." The conversation continued with my father explaining that Jordan's educational path was different because he had shown more academic promise and would be attending a more prestigious university that required full family support. You see, San Diego wasn't just more expensive than UC Riverside. It was also more important for establishing the kind of professional network that would benefit the family business in the future. Jordan's education was an investment in everyone's success. While my education was a personal responsibility that I needed to handle independently, the math was simple and brutal. Jordan's 4-year education at UC San Diego would cost approximately $160,000, including tuition, housing, meal plans, and spending money. My father was not only willing, but eager to provide every penny, treating it as an investment in Jordan's future and the family legacy? My education at UC Riverside, which would cost roughly $60,000 total, was my own problem to solve through student loans, part-time employment, and whatever financial aid I could secure independently. But the financial disparity was only part of the larger pattern of systematic exclusion that defined my final years living in their house. Family vacations became opportunities for Rebecca to demonstrate her generosity toward Jordan, while emphasizing my outsider status. Their annual ski trip to Aspen included Jordan's friends, but not mine. Their summer cruise featured Jordan's girlfriend, but no invitation for anyone I might want to bring along. When I asked about joining these family activities, I was told that space was limited and costs needed to be controlled, though somehow there was always room and budget for Jordan's companions. Holiday celebrations became elaborate productions designed to showcase Rebecca's domestic skills and their family's prosperity to friends and extended relatives. Thanksgiving dinner featured expensive wines, premium ingredients, and careful attention to a presentation that impressed their guests and reinforced their status as successful hosts. But my contributions to these events were minimized and my presence barely acknowledged. When relatives asked about my plans for college or career, Rebecca would quickly redirect the conversation to Jordan's achievements and future prospects. The most painful aspect of this systematic exclusion was watching Jordan's enthusiastic participation in my marginalization. My half-brother had been only 12 when our mother died, old enough to remember Helen but young enough to be shaped by Rebecca's influence during his formative teenage years. Under her guidance, Jordan learned to see me not as his older brother, but as a cautionary example of what happened when someone lacked ambition and failed to embrace the opportunities that successful families provided. Jordan's attitude toward me transformed from typical sibling rivalry into something much colder and more calculated. He began referring to my part-time jobs as proof that I wasn't serious about my future, while his summer internships at my father's company were described as valuable professional development. When I worked weekends to save money for college, Jordan characterized my efforts as evidence that I didn't understand how successful people actually built wealth, according to his evolving worldview, influenced heavily by Rebecca's philosophy. My willingness to perform manual labor demonstrated a lack of vision rather than a strong work ethic. The breaking point came during a family dinner when I announced that I had been accepted to, Riverside's business program, and would be starting in the fall with a combination of financial aid, student loans, and money I had saved from working. Instead of congratulations, I received a lecture about the importance of choosing career paths that would lead to real success, rather than settling for mediocre achievements that would keep me trapped in middle-class limitations. Rebecca used this opportunity to contrast my choices with Jordan's acceptance to UC San Diego's competitive business program, emphasizing that his opportunities for networking and advancement would position him for leadership roles in major corporations or successful entrepreneurship. According to her analysis, my decision to attend a less prestigious local university while working part-time demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of how successful people actually built their careers. My father nodded along with Rebecca's assessment, adding his own observations about the importance of thinking bigger and taking calculated risks rather than choosing safe, limited paths that would never lead to significant wealth or status. He talked about successful people he knew who had leveraged family resources and social connections to build impressive careers, implying that my independent approach was both unnecessary and counterproductive. The dinner conversation revealed the complete transformation of my father's values and priorities. The man who had once taken pride in working with his hands and building quality homes for working families now spoke dismissively about any career path that didn't lead to executive-level income and social status. The Bill Thompson, who had taught me to respect honest work and value personal integrity, had been replaced by someone who measured worth exclusively through financial achievement and social positioning. Jordan absorbed these lessons eagerly, developing a worldview that categorized people into winners and losers based on their educational credentials, professional connections, and material possessions. Under Rebecca's influence, he learned to see empathy and loyalty as weaknesses that successful people couldn't afford to indulge. By the time he left for college, Jordan had internalized the belief that family relationships were valuable only insofar as they contributed to personal advancement and social status. The final insult came when I moved out of their house to start college. Rebecca organized a farewell dinner that was really a celebration of my departure, emphasizing how much more peaceful and harmonious their home would be without the tension my presence had created. She talked about this transition as an opportunity for me to finally grow up and learn independence, while also noting how much easier it would be for them to focus on Jordan's promising future without worrying about my struggles and limitations. That evening, as I packed my belongings into my aging Honda Civic, I realized that I wasn't just leaving their house. I was being expelled from a family that had decided I was incompatible with their vision of success and respectability. The people who shared my last name had become strangers who viewed my existence as an embarrassment and my aspirations as evidence of limited thinking. But as I drove away from the McMansion in Riverside Hills toward my tiny studio apartment near campus, I felt something unexpected alongside the pain of rejection, relief. I was finally free from the constant pressure to conform to their narrow definition of worth and success. For the first time in years, I could focus entirely on building the life I wanted, rather than seeking approval from people who would never offer it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.